This week on Dialogue, America's War Machine. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Our guest this week is Wilson Center public policy scholar Molly McCartney. Molly is also a journalist with more than 30 years' experience as a reporter at 5 different newspapers, including 10 years at the Miami Herald and nearly 15 years at the Washington Post, where she wrote under the byline Molly Sinclair. Molly, welcome to Dialogue. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome.
You feel like Miami Herald, with the weather here in Washington, you feel like Miami has migrated north with you, I think, the way things are going. I want to begin, Molly, before we delve into the subject matter, with asking you about the title and the selection of the title. It certainly seems at odds with the way most Americans view themselves and their nation. Not a war state, not an imperialistic power, but a peacemaker, the world's policeman. Tell us about the title and the selection of the title.
You're absolutely right. This is a country where we think of ourselves as peace-loving. And the idea that we have a vested interest in war is a concept that's alien to many people and would be denied by others. Jim used that term in describing the complex of forces that are involved in our military defense policies and in our actual military defense as a country, is a way to sort of help people understand what it's about. It's helpful when you're writing stories about these things to give people something to think about in terms of a concept. And his idea was the American war machine is a way to sum up the effect of these forces. What are the forces? Well, in 1961, President Eisenhower made a speech about something he called the military-industrial complex, and he warned this was a threat to democracy and that we had to be very careful about the impact and the influence of those forces. He did not include Congress as part of the complex, even though it was in his speech, and he took it out thinking or on the premise that it wasn't quite right for one branch of government to criticize another.
Well, how times have
changed.
Times have changed. That would be the lead line in today's speech.
That's right. But the point is that it does include Congress, and the point of the book is that it includes really more than the military and the industrial and Congress. It also includes the experts in intelligence who exaggerate threats, and it includes the think tanks which have developed in recent years, which churn out papers and experts who talk about threats and military policy and really provide a rationale for some of the things we do in defense. These are typically more on the right, although they do also have some on the left.
Well, you know, it's I brought the quote with me because the Eisenhower speech is referenced all the time, and I'm not always sure how many people know it. So I'm going to read the critical passage here, a little more than what is normally quoted. This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. And then here's the passage that is most commonly quoted. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. One thing I find interesting about this is the Eisenhower farewell address, 1961, January, is that it's one of the most quoted presidential modern speeches. It's referenced all of the time, and yet it doesn't seem like we've heeded the warning.
We haven't.
We like to talk about it, but we don't really act on it.
He wasn't heeded, as you correctly say, and the problem is much bigger now and much more serious because of the size of the forces involved in the war machine and because of the amount of money involved. And we are again, having a conversation heat up about those spending expenses. And you're going to hear more about this over the next year as once again, there's a review of what we spend, not only on defense, but other things, and where did the cuts come from, how much from defense. But Eisenhower, interestingly enough, at the time, that speech, I went back and looked at how it was covered. The big story out of that speech were what he had to say about the economy. The references to the military-industrial complex were not part of the headline on the front page because he phrased it in such a way nobody was, particularly the reporters, were sure what he was talking about. My husband, who covered the speech, said later, you know, I hear what he says, but what does it mean? As a result of that speech, by the way, my husband, Jim McCartney, who's actually...
We should talk about who this...
Let me explain.
We should bring the viewers and listeners in on who Jim McCartney is.
This is a book that my husband had almost finished when he died last year. His name was James McCartney. He was a national security reporter for Knight Ridder for more than 20 years. And let me give you some of his background, which will explain his credentials for the position he takes and also the passion that he brings to this issue, which was really a lifelong, as it turned out, theme that he kept coming back to over and over again. He actually got to know the military up close and personal in World War II. He graduated from high school in 1943 in East Lansing, Michigan, and he got his draft notice about the same time he got his high school diploma. He was shipped off to Europe after basic training and was part of what they call the Southern invasion of France and Germany, not Normandy Beach, but in November, I think, of '44. He spent 1944 and 45 in a foxhole in the Vosges Mountains in southern France. It was very cold. He had a summer uniform. The Army never got winter uniforms to these guys. He was wounded in April and in the hospital, actually, when the war ended. He came back to the U.S. He enrolled in college and got his degree using the GI Bill. And as part of his college experience, he got into journalism. And became editor of his high school or his college newspaper. This was Michigan State College, now Michigan State University. So from there, he then picked up a master's degree at Northwestern and went to work for the Chicago Daily News. In 1960, he was promoted and sent to Washington to be in the Bureau's Washington Bureau, and that's how he happened to be covering the Eisenhower speech in 1961. After that speech, and because he felt it was important but not quite sure what it was, he proposed to his editor that he do a series of stories about it. And they said fine. So in November of '61, the Chicago Daily News and other newspapers, because they had customers and there was a sharing going on, published a 5-part series that he wrote. And the headline is very telling. The headline on the series was, "Our $25 billion tug of war, defense is everybody's business." Now today, the headline would be our $1 trillion.
Right, $25 billion would be
right.
a bargain.
It'd be a $1 trillion tug of war. But the stories are basically the same. It's the constant purchasing of expensive weapons. It's the ongoing expense of maintaining a military, which continues to be.
Did Jim's reporting at the time of the speech, or your research since, as you've picked up the baton, does it tell us where this came from as far as Eisenhower? Was this something that he had been thinking about for a long time and wanted to express in this final speech? What do we know the genesis of why he provided this warning?
Well, I think his own background would tell us that. I think what's more interesting is why he didn't do it until he was on his way out of the White House. And I have not looked at that question. It may be in some of the newer books that are coming out now. I think there's a new one called Eisenhower and War and Peace that may explore that question. But no, we don't know exactly why he chose the timing he did. But I think this was a guy who knew the military, and he also, as president, could see what was happening.
Well, as did your husband,
right.
Military. And this is a common thread as well. The most reluctant warriors are actually the people who've been real warriors.
That's right.
Versus the so-called chicken hawks who are ready to rattle the saber without ever having served.
That's right. That's exactly right. The other thing that happened with Jim was that in 1968, the night newspapers which became Knight Ridder, now McClatchy, hired him as their national security reporter for the Washington Bureau. And for the next 20-plus years, he went all over the world covering national security. He was in Vietnam. He was all over the Middle East. He covered most of the U.S.-Soviet summits. He covered the nuclear issue, another one of his passions. So his stories, day after day after day, would delve into sort of the Pentagon lust for weapons, the defense industry's eagerness to get the contracts to build the weapons, members of Congress who were approving the weapons because it meant jobs for their district and money for their local economies, the intelligence experts who were exaggerating threats, and then in more recent years, the evolution of the think tanks, which evolved to basically provide rationale for the position of the people that they shared a common ideology. So from all of that, he developed his own thinking about this, his own judgment on what it was. And then after he retired from daily journalism in 1990, he began teaching at Georgetown University. And one of his most popular courses was War and Peace in the Media, which contained a large component on the military-industrial complex. We went to Florida thinking we would retire in 2004. And this was about the time that we were getting into the Iraq War. And this sort of revived all of his thinking and judgments.
So in his mind, this is here we go again?
Here we go again.
Yeah.
And I can tell you one particular incident I remember. We had a dinner party, I think either the night of or the night after Colin Powell made his presentation at the UN. And there had been some certain uncertainty about, well, you know, do they really have those weapons? Should we really do this? But the Colin Powell presentation was like, well, of course we must do it. So we're at this dinner party with people who normally would have said, well, we don't know, or we don't think it's a good idea. And they were all sort of, well, Colin said it was there.
Well,
let's
most
do it.
credible men in America at the time.
And Jim stood up and said, you are all wrong. Those are buildings in those photographs. We don't know what's in them. They have not proved that there are weapons of mass destruction. This is a mistake. We should never do it. That kind of passion led him to being invited a number of places to make speeches about things, which of course went back to the issue of military.
Also that good old-fashioned journalistic skepticism.
That's right. You got it. And he began making speeches. He'd already been teaching and writing on this issue, even in Florida. And people would listen to his presentation, which he would use facts and statistics to basically support what he was saying. And he had his own experience that he could talk about. And at the end of the speech, there would sort of be a buzz, like, we didn't know this, we didn't understand that's how it worked, please write a book. He sat down 2 years ago to do that, and he had pretty much finished the manuscript when he died last year. And people said to me, what is going to happen to Jim's book now that he's died? You have to finish it. You have to get this out. So that's what I'm here to try to
do. Now, and so do you approach this, Molly, exclusively as a labor of love in finishing your husband's unfinished work, or do you share his views? Have you come through your own exposure to the thinking, your own research?
I've listened to this for 25 years. I had a very good education on this as a result. And I have to say, I found him to be right so many times, over and over again. His judgment on these issues, as it was with Iraq, they don't have those weapons of mass destruction, as we have now learned. He was consistently right in his judgment. So I would have to say I'm pretty convinced that he was on the right path.
Has the project changed at all under your watch?
No.
Any elements of focus?
No. The book is his book. What it needs is some updating because a lot's happened in the last year. There were new spending numbers. There's a more heated debate about the spending. And there's some other things. And I think one of my contributions will be to write an introduction that says who he is and why he cared and why he's right. Mm-hmm. But the rest of the book is together. It's there. It's ready to roll.
Tell us who are some of the players that are looked at in the book, who are either corporations, individuals. Where does the money trail lead as far as making this case?
Okay, well, let me just give you some numbers first,
sure.
which actually I just updated myself within the last couple of weeks to make sure we were on the right.
They change daily, right? The amounts.
Well, and you can argue them from almost any point of view. But I think these are fairly accurate. And And I would say that you could say today that the U.S. spent twice as much on defense in the decade after 2000 as we did during the Cold War. Twice as much.
Twice as much.
You can say fairly, I think, that U.S. defense spending today is on average 20 to 30% higher than it was in the Cold War. That's on average. I think you could say that U.S. defense spending today is probably close to an all-time high. It probably peaked a couple of years ago, but it's still way up there. I think you can say that the U.S. is now spending $1 trillion a year on defense. That includes everything: the Pentagon, nuclear, Veterans Administration, the wars, Homeland Security. You know, just throw everything together and you got $1 trillion a year.
And is it fair to say that this is not simply a reaction to 9/11, that these are trends that were in place before 9/11?
I think you could say that 9/11 did not reduce the cost.
Certainly accelerated the...
Right.
Yeah.
I
guess what I'm asking you was...
I understand, right.
Because I read one criticism of U.S. defense spending saying that this is essentially unmoored from the Soviet threat, which was a focal point. This has become sort of this amorphous, out-of-control thing that doesn't really know where to target, but it spends a lot in not knowing where to target.
That's exactly right. And I think the other thing... a couple of other things. You can say that the two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have probably cost us over $1 trillion, and the expectation is that that could double or triple given the ongoing care of the veterans with these horrendous injuries they come home with. And the other number that's interesting is the amount we spend compared to the rest of the world. It's about as much as the rest of the world spends altogether combined.
On everything.
Now, you know, there's some argument that it's more. There's an argument that it's not quite that much, but it's in that range. So I think you had asked me one of the questions for whether there's really is an American war machine. I would say follow the money.
Follow the money.
Follow the money.
Let me ask you, along those lines of following the money, this often will break down as a political or a partisan debate, I should say.
Yes.
In that traditionally those on the right support strong military and military spending. Those on the left are seen as not supporting that. But here's the thing. If you look at the history, it appears that the spending continues no matter who's in power.
Both sides support this. And the reason makes sense. These are members of Congress. They're looking at the district and their district and the economy in their district. And what happens with the defense contractors, very smart guys, they make sure that the places where those weapons are built, not weapons only, but also planes, you know, ships, all of the military armaments, they don't get built in one spot. They get spread all over the country into as many states and congressional districts as possible, which makes it almost impossible, if you represent that district, to vote against it, because those are jobs, and that's money for your local economy. And it's also money for your campaign to run again if you're an incumbent. So there is a money issue here that is feeding this machine. It's not new, but it has evolved into a more and more of a bigger problem because of the amounts of the money and because money fuels what Congress does and how the people who are in Congress get there.
Another issue that comes up in this discussion is how do you criticize the military-industrial complex without appearing to criticize the individual men and women who serve? That becomes this political trap where anything we say, I'm sure there are people listening to our discussion today who are angry because we appear to be somehow critical,
unpatriotic,
or unpatriotic, maybe at the purest sense of the criticism. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's unfortunate, and I think that again, if you look at the money, that will take some of the emotion out of it. And if you look at the pattern of the way this works, one thing the book very strongly does is say, we are not saying this is a conspiracy. We are not saying anybody's bad. We're saying simply, this is how it works. This is the way it works, and if you understand this, then maybe you as an informed citizen we'll have some questions for the people representing you in Congress, and maybe even some ideas about who you want to support in the next congressional race, because it's really up to the public to make these changes. The root of this is the money. And I think in terms of whether you're patriotic or unpatriotic, there will always be some division there on how much you want to cut defense. There are those who would believe you can't cut it ever because we have to be safe, and the only way to be safe is if we have the most bombs and airplanes and ships and tanks. And there will others who will say, well, wait a minute, we have a sort of a money problem in this country. Maybe we could spend a little less on defense and put it into education and health care and green jobs, or maybe pay down the deficit.
Well, there are people even within the military who talk about defense
Absolutely.
in a more holistic way, and they talk about those types of investments in education or things that build a stronger country, not just militarily strong.
That's right. And I want to mention one quote that I thought was quite interesting. This is from a guy named Gordon Adams, who was quoted in a recent Time article. Gordon Adams oversaw the Pentagon spending in the Clinton years. And he was recently quoted as saying that about 1/3 of the defense budget is for spending what Congress wants for its home districts. And that's also been described to me, that he put it this way, that 1/3 of the spending is sort of must-have stuff. 1/3 is for stuff that is kind of nice to have, and 1/3 is because Congress wants us to have it.
The job program, essentially, district by district.
Right.
So with all of this momentum, with the momentum you describe, who needs a conspiracy, right? It just works.
That's the way it works. I mean, these are human institutions full of humans. And the other thing in terms of conspiracy, somebody was saying to me the other day, as a matter of fact, the government is not capable of conspiracy because that would assume a certain level of competence and sort of, planning that would make things come out
secrets
that way.
Which people aren't good at.
Right. So nobody, at least in this book, is suggesting there's a conspiracy. What we're saying is this is the way the system works. Jim saw it as a war machine, as a way to help people understand it and the implications of it.
Is there a way out?
Well, this is no.
No, you've come to the conclusion that it...
Let me put it this way. I don't know of a way out. The foreseeable future is that, yes, there will be some cuts in spending. In fact, there have already been some cuts from a couple of years ago, and we're going to be forced to make some more. But the fight is on. I mean, this morning's Washington Post had a story by Walter Pincus, as a matter of fact, and I cut it out. Congress is balking at Defense Department's proposed cuts. So this is not going to end with everybody easily agreeing, because it involves cuts
even
in your district.
Even under intense pressure to
That's
cut
right.
spending.
Yeah. But where do you cut? I mean, you don't want to cut in my district where I have bases and jobs and money. Let's cut your district. So this is where it really gets hard. And trends. Okay, let me just mention one other trend. Jim, who I think had a very good long view of things, even though he died a year ago, he had already concluded from everything he was reading and following in this issue that because you have these forces and you have what he described as a machine, you got to have an enemy. Okay? Now, we had the Soviets. That was a long time ago. And then we had Al-Qaeda, but bin Laden is dead, and really all our Cold War stuff really didn't help us with Al-Qaeda very much. I think you would have to agree. So how do we justify spending what we do on defense, or at least as much as we spend? Well, we got to have an enemy. How about China? It's growing, it's big, it's got military ideas.
It's also a business partner.
That's right, but there has been testimony before Congress by military people who say they stay awake at night worrying about the potential impact of the growing Chinese military muscle. Now, nobody's saying you can't ignore China, but is it really the boogeyman that some people would make it out to be? Jim didn't think that it was, but he was saying, think about this when you start talking about China as a threat, because just remember the idea that we need some sort of enemy to justify all this. And I would say that in talking to somebody this week, as a matter of fact, there does seem to be something called the arc of crisis, which seems to, as I understand it, be moving or maybe already moved from Northeast Asia to the Pacific. You just had Obama announce a plan for some Marines to be in Australia and so forth. So there is sort of a refocusing more to that area, which will mean spending, military armaments, a preparation for war, even if we never go to war, because you got to be ready. So there is sort of that trend
going to war
along,
with your credit union. Or something
well,
like
right, but another person I spoke to, I think, put it this way: when you think in terms of what's the future, why do we keep doing this? And somebody summed it up as this way: we're in an arms race with ourselves. We keep developing fancier and fancier weapons, and again, this guy described it as you get 1 inch of improvement for 3 inches more of money. Mm-hmm. So
racing with yourself, I guess that makes you both the winner and the loser, unfortunately. Molly, speaking of the future, closer to home, with about the 30 seconds we have remaining, what's the timeline for completion of the book? When will we see the completed
I'm here
project?
until May 31st.
Here at the Wilson Center.
And my hope is to have it done by then.
Oh, wow, ambitious. Okay, great. Well, we look forward to the book. Thanks for sharing this discussion with us. And sorry about the loss of Jim, but I have to say this is terrific for him to have his work completed in such a way.
It's a terrific piece of work, and I think it deserves to be out there, part of the conversation.
Right. Thank you very much. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.